The plates were already on the table when I walked in. Darren always made a point to arrive 5 minutes early. Jessa exactly on time, as if promptness could disguise how far we'd all drifted. The place hadn't changed. Soft paneled walls, mismatched mugs, the smell of spiced butter and burnt toast still lingering in the corners. I chose the same table near the window, the one where I could watch the lake behind the bakery. Snow was just beginning to fall, thin and slow, barely layering the frozen shoreline. I sat down without a word. I hadn't expected warmth, but part of me still carried a reflex, a flicker that maybe this year would be different, that maybe someone had saved me a seat out of want, not habit. Jessa didn't take off her coat. She sat upright, phone turned face down beside her plate. Darren glanced at me, gave a half smile, then looked away before anything real could surface. When the waitress brought the coffee, I thanked her. Jessa didn't wait. She reached into her coat pocket, pulled out a folded napkin, and placed it next to her saucer like she was anchoring herself. "We've talked it over," she said, not looking at me, "and we think it's best if this Christmas is just us. You know, something simple." Her voice didn't waver, but she didn't touch her coffee. I nodded, not in agreement, just in understanding that the moment had come and gone before I even had a chance to breathe it in. Darren cleared his throat but said nothing. I reached for my muffin. It was still warm, still the same blueberry lemon I ordered every Sunday. I didn't take a bite. I set it down and folded my hands. Jessa kept talking, something about Becca being at an age where she needed space, about how Jonah was too young to notice anyway. Her words were neat, rehearsed, the kind that fit inside a holiday card without smudging the ink. I looked past her shoulder at the wreath hanging on the cafe door. It had gold ribbon this year. Last December, I remember Becca saying she liked silver better. I remembered because I had written it down. No one asked what I thought. No one asked if I had made plans or if I needed anything. I had driven there in the cold, layered in wool and routine, just to be told I was no longer required. Not resented, not scolded, just omitted, like a name skipped over during roll call. I reached into my purse, pulled out exact change, and placed it beside my plate. The coins made a soft, tidy sound, the kind of noise that doesn't interrupt anyone else's conversation. The waitress returned with gingerbread cookies in a small wax paper bag. "These are for you," she said, offering me the bag with both hands, like it meant something. I looked at her, saw the kindness in her eyes, but shook my head. "I don't need them," I said gently, then stood up. No one stopped me. Darren didn't rise. Jessa didn't shift. The chairs stayed still, their legs never scraping against the floor. I walked out with my coat still buttoned and my silence folded under my arm like an old napkin no one wanted to use again. Outside, the wind brushed against my face, not cruelly, just plainly. The sidewalk shimmered where salt had melted the top layer of ice. I walked without hurry, not because my legs ached, but because I had nowhere to be. The parking lot was nearly empty. My car waited at the far end, dusted with snow like it had been sleeping. I drove home slowly, keeping the radio off, watching the trees blur into one another along the road. It was the same stretch I had once taken every year with wrapped gifts in the back seat, each one labeled in my careful handwriting. I had believed then that love could be maintained by preparation, that if I just kept showing up, they'd remember why I mattered. Back at the apartment, I placed my keys in the bowl by the door, the one that still held a tiny pine cone Becca had painted red when she was 5. I didn't turn on the lights. The quiet filled the space without needing permission. I stood in the center of the room for a long time before walking to the attic steps, where the Christmas box waited in the dark like a ritual I had never questioned. I didn't rush to open the attic. The box had waited 11 months. It could wait a few minutes more. But I stood beneath the ladder longer than I meant to, my hand resting against the wall as if to steady something that had already gone still. When I finally reached up and unfolded the wooden steps, the sound of them unfolding felt louder than the silence below. The attic was dry, untouched, the way only disused spaces are, like a room that remembers more than it reveals. The Christmas box sat in the far corner, covered in a thin layer of dust, not enough to choke a memory, but just enough to say time had passed. I pulled it toward me, fingers brushing the edges that I had taped and retaped over the years, each corner a little soft, each label faded. Inside the same paper, snowflakes, plaid, red with silver lines, some already cut, others folded around nothing, as if waiting for a shape that never arrived. There were ornaments wrapped in old napkins, some cracked, others still whole, their hooks tangled like they'd been holding on to each other. I didn't cry. There was no need. The ache that filled me had no sharpness to it. It was more like a pressure, like cold air that presses against your chest but never quite becomes breath. I pulled out the list I had tucked in months ago. Gift ideas written in pencil, some erased, some rewritten. A juicer for Jessa, though she never thanked me for the last one. Books for Becca, soft cover only because she liked to bend the corners. A black wool scarf for Darren, like always, with a gift card slid into the hem because he never wanted cash. None of them ever asked for these things. They never told me what they wanted, but they let me guess, and I had treated that like a privilege. I folded the list, placed it back in the box, and closed the lid. The attic was colder than I remembered, and for the first time, I didn't bring the box down. Back in the kitchen, I made a cup of tea, not because I needed warmth, but because the motion of boiling water, steeping leaves, watching the steam rise, still made the day feel structured. The mug I chose had a chip on the rim, a barely there flaw that made me favor it. I carried it to the small table by the window, the one that overlooked the fire escape. Snow had started to gather on the railing, thin layers building, without being asked. I thought of all the years I had prepared for holidays without invitation, how I had measured my place by how much I brought, groceries delivered, turkeys basted, wreaths hung before anyone asked. I used to believe that if I showed up enough, they'd see me. That consistency could replace affection. But this year, for the first time, I wondered if my showing up had made it easier for them to never ask. I opened the file drawer in my bedroom, the one I used for bills and account summaries. Behind a folder labeled Utilities, I found the envelope I hadn't touched in 2 years, bank printouts, handwritten notes, a rough tally I had once started and never finished. I took it to the dining table, cleared the space, and laid each sheet side by side. My eyes scanned each amount, each date, each forgotten generosity, internet bills in my name since Becca was born, a car down payment marked as family loan that no one ever mentioned again, a medical bill for Jonah, rushed through during a winter night, paid before they could worry. None of it had come with thank yous. I hadn't waited for any. Still, I read each line as if I were discovering the weight of myself for the first time. I picked up a pen and began circling totals, not out of bitterness, but out of quiet necessity. I needed to know what I had given, because for too long I had only counted what I'd kept, and that list was far shorter. Somewhere between the column marked emergency and the one labeled extras, I found the number that made my hand pause. Over $210,000, spread across years, names, needs. I hadn't felt rich. I had just felt responsible. I stared at that number. not with shock, just with the kind of tiredness that settles in when the truth no longer surprises you. I placed the last page on the stack, smoothed it with my palm, and reached for my phone. The law office's number was still saved. I left a voicemail, steady and clear. I asked to cancel all automatic transfers. I requested a full review of every authorization still linked to my name. My voice didn't shake. When I hung up, I closed the folder and set it back in the drawer, not to bury it, but to acknowledge it had been seen. The tea had gone cold. I poured the rest down the sink, not as an ending, just as a gesture to mark the space between what had been and what would no longer be. I didn't speak to anyone the next day. There were no calls to return, no appointments to remember, no birthdays that needed my handwriting. I woke early, not because I had somewhere to be, but because I always did. The body remembers what the mind can no longer justify. I folded the blankets, brewed fresh coffee, and stared at the calendar where December 24th was marked with a soft red dot, the kind I'd once used to track Becca's recitals. I looked at it the same way I looked at an old photo, familiar but not recent. By late morning, I'd opened the cabinet above the fridge and pulled down a small metal tin that once held ginger snaps. Inside, I kept all the receipts I never meant to revisit, one for Becca's school shoes, one for Darren's utility deposit when he moved into their first apartment, one for the electric bill the month Jessa was on unpaid maternity leave. None of them large on their own, but layered, they told a different kind of story, one of someone who had been filling cracks without ever being asked. I took out a fresh manila folder and labeled it in blue ink for me. Then I sat and transferred $12,000 into a new savings account, not linked to anything but my name. It wasn't a grand gesture. No one knew but me, but it was the first time I had drawn a circle around myself without apology. I spent that afternoon walking, not far, just around the neighborhood, past houses with lit windows and wreaths hung unevenly. I passed the old church with its peeling bell tower and the corner store that still played carols too loud over the speakers. I turned onto Pine Street and, without planning to, found myself in front of the bookstore, Page and Willow. Its display window was decorated with paper snowflakes and cut-out storybooks. I stepped inside not because I wanted anything in particular, but because the air smelled like pine wood and paper, and something in me wanted to remember that combination. Evelyn, the owner, looked up from behind the counter. Her scarf was wrapped high around her neck, her sleeves pushed back, hands smudged with ink. She smiled like she'd seen me yesterday, though I hadn't come in for months. I nodded, a quiet greeting, and wandered toward the children's section. Hardcover spines in deep reds and forest greens lined the shelves, illustrations of snowmen and gingerbread houses and reindeer in flight. I picked up a copy of The Night Before Christmas, one I used to read to Darren before the words started to slur from exhaustion. A few minutes later, Evelyn walked over, carrying a cup of tea that smelled faintly of cloves. She set it on the side table and looked at me with soft amusement. "We've been looking for someone to read to the kids on Saturday mornings," she said. "They come in pajamas, sit on the rug under the tree. It's nothing formal." Her voice didn't ask for an answer. It just offered space. I looked down at the book in my lap, ran my fingers along the edge of the page. "You think I could do that?" I asked, the words quieter than I intended. Evelyn didn't hesitate. "You already do. You just haven't been doing it here." I didn't say yes. I didn't say no. I simply nodded, the way I used to when Becca handed me her drawings and said, "It's not done yet, but I want you to see it." I slipped the card with the schedule into my coat pocket. No commitments, just something that had the shape of possibility. That night, back in the apartment, I opened the drawer in the hallway and found the red scarf Becca had given me 2 years ago, The tag was still attached. I'd kept it in its box, never worn it, afraid it would fade or unravel. But something had shifted. I wrapped it around my neck and looked at myself in the mirror, not to check for beauty, but to see if I still recognized the woman inside the frame. My face was softer than I remembered, not fragile, just less pressed. I stepped onto the balcony for a moment, letting the wind tug at the corners of my coat. The street below was empty, save for a few cars parked under the yellow glow of old lamps. Somewhere, a radio played a tune I couldn't name. I stood there, holding a cup of warm cider, and whispered one sentence into the air, not for anyone else, just for me. This year, I'm not waiting to be asked. The cabin had been sitting empty for years, not abandoned, not decayed, just unused, like a favorite coat you once wore every season and then forgot in the back of a closet. It belonged to me still, on paper and in memory. Darren never asked about it, and Jessa once called it too drafty for children. I didn't tell anyone I was going. I didn't pack much, just the scarf, the small notebook I always carried, but rarely wrote in, a tin of tea leaves, and a set of keys that still opened the door. I drove slowly through the winding hills past Riverbend Hollow, the snow gathering thicker as the road narrowed. Pines stood silent on both sides, their branches heavy with the season. There was no signal up that way, and that was part of the comfort. When I turned the final bend, the cabin came into view. Not dramatic, not picturesque, just standing exactly where I left it. The front porch sagged a little more. The window panes were dusted with frost, but the door opened smoothly, the air inside carrying a trace of old wood and last year's ash. I unpacked without ceremony, placed the scarf on the hook by the fireplace, folded 2 sweaters into the drawer of the bedside table. I moved quietly through the space, each step against the wooden floorboards, reminding me of mornings spent brewing coffee for someone who no longer lived. The hearth was still stacked with kindling, a leftover generosity from a younger version of myself. I lit the fire slowly, layering paper and bark and breathing in the scent of dried pine. The first crackle was small but steady. I didn't rush it. I sat beside it and watched the flame climb the wood like it remembered the way up. There were no decorations in the cabin, no wreaths, no lights, just a few pine cones I had gathered years ago in a bowl near the window. I placed the notebook on the table and opened to a blank page. My handwriting came slower now, but more certain. I wrote a single line, not meant to be profound, only true. I came here without being asked, and that is enough. Later that day, I walked into the small town nearby, just a scattering of shops and market stalls still open for the season. Most people wore the same weary coats, hands tucked into gloves, eyes focused on the next place they needed to be. At the stand selling apples, I saw a woman I hadn't seen since high school, Colleen. She had silver hair now and moved a bit slower, but I knew her by the way she tilted her head before smiling. We didn't pretend to catch up. She held up a bag of pastries and asked if I still liked cinnamon. I said yes. We walked back toward the cabin without making plans. She stayed for a while, sitting on the steps with a mug of cocoa, her fingers curved gently around the heat. We didn't speak of holidays or children or who had called last. We spoke of weather and wood stoves and the way silence changes shape when 2 people choose to share it. As evening fell, she stood to leave, pausing just long enough to squeeze my shoulder with a kind of kindness that didn't ask questions. I watched her figure retreat down the snowy path until it disappeared behind the bend. Then I stepped back inside and closed the door, not to shut the world out, but to remind myself that this space belonged to me again. That night, the wind picked up. I could hear it moving through the trees, brushing against the windows like it remembered my name. I added another log to the fire and wrapped the scarf tighter around my shoulders. The warmth wasn't immediate, but it built slowly, like a truth that had waited years to be spoken. I sat in the armchair near the fireplace, pulled the blanket over my lap, and listened to the wood pop and settle. For the first time in decades, I didn't feel suspended between obligation and omission. I felt placed, not as a guest, not as a caregiver, just as someone who had chosen to arrive. In the stillness, I thought of the phone that hadn't rung and didn't miss it. I thought of the cookies I didn't bake, the list I didn't write, and felt no absence. There was something steadier here, something about claiming a space with no role to fulfill, no title to answer to. I didn't need to be called mom or grandma or the one who brings the gifts. I just needed to be quiet enough to hear myself say, I'm here, and that's enough. The next morning, I opened the cabinet above the sink and took down a mug I hadn't used since the last winter I spent here. It was chipped on the handle, the glaze fading around the rim, but it still held warmth the way some things do, even after being overlooked. I filled it with hot water, let the tea steep while I watched the light shift through the frost-lined window. The forest outside was still. Nothing moved but the smoke rising from my chimney and the slow fall of snow collecting on the porch railing. I sat at the table, opened my notebook again, and wrote a single line beneath the one I'd left the night before. Some things only become yours again when you stop asking for permission to keep them. I hadn't realized how long I'd been living inside other people's expectations, adjusting my arrival time, my tone of voice, even the way I sliced apples because Becca liked them peeled. None of it was cruelty, but slowly it had worn me down, like the way water shapes stone without ever meaning to. I spent the afternoon sorting through old papers I had stored in a chest beneath the bed. Most were tax records, receipts from a life that had been generous but untracked. Mixed in were a few photos. Darren as a boy, squinting in the summer sun. Becca wrapped in a towel after her first swim in the lake. Even one of Jessa, back when she still smiled without caution. I didn't tear them. I didn't frame them. I placed them back in the envelope and slid it into a drawer labeled closed. By late afternoon, I felt ready. I changed into clean clothes, tied a scarf around my neck, and drove back into town. It wasn't far, 12 minutes down a sloped road that curved past the frozen creek. I parked beside the town hall, walked past the bakery with the same apple turnovers in the window, and stepped into the law office where my name was still on file. The receptionist didn't ask why I was there. She offered me a seat and a clipboard. I filled it out slowly, deliberately, like someone recalculating a long-forgotten equation. When I met with Mr. Redley, my attorney for the past 14 years, he looked at the file I handed him and then looked at me. I could tell he'd read the numbers before. He just hadn't known who they were for. I sat across from him with my hands folded and told him I wanted to remove all financial authorizations connected to Darren's family. No more shared utilities, no more auto renewals, no more quiet bailouts. I asked to revise my will. He nodded slowly, said nothing unnecessary. When he passed the revised form across the table, I signed it without hesitation. Before I left, he handed me a sheet of paper. He said he usually gave to recent retirees. It might not apply, he said, but I think it's still true. It read, they didn't forget you. They just assumed you'd never stop showing up. I folded it once, placed it in the same pocket where I kept Evelyn's storytime schedule, and stepped back into the cold. The walk to my car felt lighter. The snow beneath my boots crunched softly, not dragging at the soles the way it had before. I stopped by the market on the way back, picked up a bag of oranges and a loaf of sourdough, not because anyone expected me to cook, but because I wanted the smell of warm bread to fill the cabin that night. When I got home, I lit the fireplace again, sliced 3 oranges, and laid them on the windowsill where the light touched the rind. The wind outside had shifted, a little sharper now, but inside, the air stayed steady. I took the signed documents and placed them in a folder marked private, tucked deep in the back of the desk drawer. There were no phone calls that night, no messages sent, no questions asked. I didn't need them. The cabin walls were close, but not suffocating. The fire crackled without prompting, and for the first time, I realized I had stopped waiting for the next demand to arrive. I poured myself another cup of tea and stood near the window, watching the pine trees lean ever so slightly against the wind. I thought of every dollar I had given freely, every holiday I had carried without being asked. I thought of how long it had taken me to speak a full sentence for myself. Not a refusal, not a protest, just a boundary wrapped in quiet intention. No announcements, no thunder, just the act of closing a door that had always been left open out of habit. That weekend, I returned to the bookstore. The roads had cleared slightly, just enough for the tires to grip without strain. I arrived before opening, parked near the lamppost, with the old wreath still tied crookedly at the top, and sat for a few minutes before going in. The street was quiet, no footsteps on the sidewalk yet, just the soft rhythm of winter holding its breath. Inside, Evelyn was unpacking a new shipment of children's books, her sleeves rolled, her hands moving with the kind of calm that comes from routine. She looked up and nodded toward the back. "You're early," she said, not surprised. I took off my coat, hung it near the door, and walked slowly toward the small reading nook. The rug had been vacuumed, the little wooden stools arranged in a semicircle, and beneath the paper tree taped to the wall, a stack of gently used storybooks waited. The children arrived in pairs and trios, some holding Coco, others dragging small plush animals by the arm. They shuffled in without much noise, their parents lingering at the threshold, just long enough to make sure someone would keep watch. I sat on the low bench near the window, book in hand, and waited until they settled. No one asked who I was. No one asked what brought me here. They simply looked up at me with quiet eyes, waiting. I read slowly, not for effect, but to make space for the words to land. The story was simple. An old woman who lived in a cabin surrounded by pine trees, who once built snow lanterns to guide lost animals home. The children didn't interrupt. A few leaned forward, a few leaned into each other. They didn't ask why the woman lived alone. They didn't question how she knew which way to point the lanterns. They just listened. When the story ended, one child asked if I would read another. I nodded. I hadn't planned to. I hadn't even brought a second book. But Evelyn handed me one from the nearby stack and whispered, "They like the ones with squirrels." So I began again, my voice steady, my hands turning the pages with a rhythm I didn't know I still remembered. For those 40 minutes, I was no one's guest, no one's grandmother, no one's unpaid helper. I was simply the woman with a voice they trusted to carry them through winter woods and cozy kitchens and magical midnight walks. After the children left, I stayed behind to help fold the blankets and straighten the cushions. Evelyn offered me a cup of tea, and we sat quietly near the counter while the light faded outside. She didn't ask me anything, just refilled the sugar bowl and dusted the edge of a shelf. Before I left, she handed me a small sign printed on thick cardstock, "Mary Elaine, Storyteller in Residence." I looked at it for a long moment. It didn't say Mom. It didn't say Grandma. It didn't carry the weight of anything I hadn't chosen. I folded it gently and slid it into my coat pocket. That night, back at the cabin, I laid the sign on the kitchen table and lit the fire early. The flames caught quickly, the warmth spreading through the floorboards like something earned. I made soup from scratch, not because anyone would be eating with me, but because I wanted to feed myself something that didn't come from a box. I lit a small candle in the window, not to signal guests, but to remind myself I was home. I didn't expect the knock. It came softly, just after dusk, 2 short raps followed by a longer pause. I opened the door and found Mr. Rohr from across the hill, bundled in a thick wool coat, holding a small tin wrapped in wax paper. He didn't explain. He just nodded and handed me the tin. Inside were oatmeal cookies with raisins, slightly uneven, clearly made by hand. I thanked him without saying the word. He turned and walked back into the snow, his boots leaving a neat trail behind him. I closed the door and set the cookies beside the fire. I didn't eat them right away. I just looked at them for a while, the way one might look at an old photograph, not for the image, but for what it stirs. There was no card, no message, just something left at the doorstep by someone who understood what it meant to be alone without asking to be rescued. And that night, for the first time in many seasons, I didn't wait for the phone to ring. I didn't rehearse what I might say if it did. I just sat by the fire, a book open in my lap, a blanket folded at my feet, and the quiet hum of pine trees bending in the wind, reminding me that sometimes choosing not to be needed is the first act of remembering who you are. 3 days before Christmas, I saw the SUV from the window. It was the same silver gray model Darren had bought after his promotion, the one Jessa said was perfect for strollers and grocery runs. It pulled up slowly, wheels crunching against the gravel in that deliberate way people drive when they aren't sure they're welcome. The windows stayed fogged for a while, then the engine cut. They didn't get out right away. I stood near the counter, tea still warm in my hand, and watched them through the frosted glass without stepping back. Eventually, the doors opened. Jessa emerged first, holding a box wrapped in red ribbon. Darren followed behind, hands in pockets, face half hidden beneath a knit hat. Becca was last, wearing a red hoodie and carrying something small and round, the shape of pine needles pressed together. I didn't move until they reached the porch. When the knock came, I opened the door, just enough to see them clearly. I didn't ask what they were doing there. I didn't pretend to be surprised. I only said, "There's coffee, if you want to come in." They entered quietly. No one removed their coats. No one looked straight at me. I motioned toward the chairs near the fire, then turned back to the kitchen to pour 3 cups. I didn't ask how they took it. I didn't offer sugar. I placed the cups on the table, one by one, and took my seat without a word. Jessa set the gift box in the center, careful not to knock over the candle. Darren sat near the window, glancing around like someone visiting a place he used to own. Becca stood close to the small pine tree I'd assembled in the corner, just branches in a vase, with paper bows and pine cones from the backyard. She placed her wreath on the table, hand-twisted, uneven but made with real fingers. No one reached for anything. I waited. The fire filled the space where words might have landed. Jessa spoke first. Her voice was softer than usual, but rehearsed. "I know it was sudden. You leaving, I mean. We didn't expect—" She paused. "Becca missed you." I turned toward Becca. She didn't speak, just pressed her lips together, then looked at the wreath she'd placed down. I touched the edge of it, the frayed ribbon curling slightly under my palm. I nodded once, not in forgiveness, not in approval, just acknowledgement that something had been offered. Darren finally looked up. "You leaving? It made everything feel different." He didn't finish the thought. He didn't say whether it was better or worse. He just let the sentence fall between us, unfinished. I poured more tea, refilled my own cup, and said nothing. I watched them from across the table the way I had once watched them sleep in their childhood beds, certain I would always be the one to worry first, to arrive earliest, to clean up after the storm passed. But now, the storm was behind me, and I had built something quieter in its place. Jessa reached into her coat pocket and pulled out a small tin. "We brought gingerbread," she said. "Becca picked the flavor you like." I didn't open the tin. I didn't thank her. Not out of rudeness, but because I had lived long enough to know not everything placed in your hands is love. Some things are offerings made out of guilt or habit or the discomfort of silence. I picked up Becca's wreath and walked it gently into the bedroom. I hung it on the door using the same nail that had held dozens of Christmas cards in the years when people still mailed them. She followed me with her eyes, but didn't say anything. That was enough. Her silence didn't feel like absence. It felt like effort. Back in the main room, I sat in my chair by the fire. Darren looked toward the window, hands still folded. "Are you coming back?" he asked. The question hung like frost on the glass, delicate, waiting to melt. I shook my head, not slowly, not dramatically, just enough for him to understand. "I see," he said. Then, after a pause, "It feels empty." I looked at him, the boy who once feared thunder, who hid behind me when snow slid off the roof with a crash. He had a home now, a family, a mortgage, and yet still didn't know how to measure what a mother's space truly held. I didn't scold, I didn't soothe. I just said, as evenly as the firelight, "I'm not angry, I just don't live by instructions anymore." They stayed a little while longer, sipping slowly, avoiding the places where a sharpness might still echo. When they stood to leave, I didn't walk them to the door. I stayed where I was, hand resting on the edge of the table, the heat from the ceramic cup warming just enough of my fingers to remind me I was still present. Through the window, I saw them step into the snow, the SUV door opening, then closing again. Before they drove off, Becca turned back. She looked up toward the cabin and smiled. Not wide, not seeking approval, just a small, unsure smile that carried the shape of something I used to wear on my own face. I didn't smile back, but I watched her until the car disappeared behind the trees. After they left, I didn't touch the teacups. I let them sit there on the table, half full, cooling slowly, as if their quiet descent into room temperature might reveal something I hadn't said aloud. The fire was still going, steady now, a soft rhythm behind everything. I added one more log and watched it catch with the ease of something expected. Nothing had broken. No doors had slammed. No one had raised their voice. But something had shifted in the room, like furniture that no longer sat in its original place, but somehow fit better that way. I walked into the kitchen, unwrapped the tin of gingerbread, and placed it on the counter. I didn't eat one. I didn't throw them away either. They could sit for a while, not as a symbol, not as a memory, just as an object someone once left behind when they didn't quite know what to say. The wreath Becca made still hung on the bedroom door. I looked at it again before going to bed, traced one of the paper snowflakes with the back of my finger. It had bent a little under its own weight, but it hadn't torn. That night, I slept without interruption. No dreams, no jolts, no half-remembered lists waking me before dawn. The cabin held its warmth. The fire dimmed as it should. Morning arrived in its slow, quiet way. When I opened the curtains, the snow had settled into thick, soft layers that blanketed the steps, the trees, and the path leading back to town. It looked untouched, like no one had ever come, though I knew they had. Some absences take up more space than arrivals, but this one felt different. I had opened the door and I had closed it. That mattered. I spent most of the day cleaning, not to impress anyone, just because the act of wiping, folding, straightening made the space more mine. I lined the windows with old newspapers to block the draft, rearranged the books on the shelf by topic instead of color, made a batch of soup and froze half of it. No one knew. No one needed to. And still, for the first time in a long time, I felt seen, not by others, but by the quiet. It had learned how to mirror me. In the afternoon, I sat with my notebook again and made a new list. Not for Christmas, not for shopping, just names, places, things I wanted to do, not for someone else, but because they had once belonged to me. I wrote paint, though I hadn't touched a brush in years. I wrote write letters, even though I had no addresses to send them to. I wrote read aloud again and underlined it, not because I needed the bookstore, but because I wanted to feel that stillness again, the kind that only arrives when no one is watching for performance. Near sunset, I opened the file cabinet and took out the envelope with all the old receipts. I read through them once more, then tucked them into a smaller envelope and labeled it simply, done. I didn't shred them. I didn't hide them. I just moved them from one category to another. I took the folder with the revised authorizations and placed it at the front. Then I opened a new one and labeled it mine. Inside, I placed a short note written in even script. No gifts, no transfers, no proof, just presents. Later that evening, I bundled up and walked down to the postbox, not to mail anything, but to stretch my legs and feel the cold touch my skin. Along the road, the streetlights flickered on slowly, bathing everything in a dim gold. Across the street, I saw a woman counting change into a small cup, gloves frayed at the fingers, eyes lowered. She reminded me of myself, not in shape or story, but in the way her body curved inward, as if trying to hold together something that had come loose years before. I didn't approach her. I didn't need to. I just stood for a while, letting the wind pass between us. And in that moment, I understood something I hadn't been able to name before. There are people who give until they become invisible, who believe that staying useful is the only way to stay loved. But usefulness fades. What remains is what you choose to gather when no one is watching. When I returned to the cabin, the fire had died down. I rebuilt it from kindling, relit it with slow patience, and sat in the armchair wrapped in my old cardigan. The sign from Evelyn still sat on the table. I hadn't put it up yet, but I looked at it now and smiled, not because of what it said, but because for once it said only my name. Nothing more, nothing less. By New Year's Day, the wreath on my door had begun to lose its green. The needles dried slowly, curling inward like they were closing in on themselves. I didn't replace it. I let it sit where it was, fading naturally, reminding me that not everything offered with care needed to be preserved forever. Some things are meant to soften and go, even when made by small, gentle hands. The days that followed were slow and clean. I received a letter from the bookstore, an invitation to return, not as an employee, but as a guest speaker for a series on aging and authorship. Evelyn had put my name on the list without asking. She wrote in the margin, "You once said nothing you had to say mattered anymore." I disagree. I stared at that line longer than the rest. I read it again before putting the envelope away. I didn't answer right away. I wanted to sit with the idea first. In my old life, I would have replied the same day, eager, polite, almost apologetic for being considered. Now I made tea, let the letter rest on the kitchen table for days, and waited until the urge to answer came from inside, not from the habit of being agreeable. In town, I saw them sometimes. Jessa at the co-op, always alone, always rushed. She'd pass me in the aisles, pretend to glance at the yogurt as if it had changed since last week. I never broke her illusion. I let her have the distance she clearly needed to feel like she'd made the right choices. I had no interest in erasing her discomfort. It was hers to carry now. Darren called once, just once. I saw his name flash on the phone Evelyn had given me, and I let it ring. There was no message. I didn't need one. Some silences don't ask to be filled. They're answers in themselves. Becca sent a drawing. A house in the woods, smoke curling from the chimney, a red cardinal perched on a branch. Inside the envelope was a small note, written in crooked letters. It read, "This is you." I pinned it on the fridge beside Evelyn's photo, not as a display, but as a reminder that children notice what adults try to bury. By February, the lawyer called. A new will had been filed, one I wasn't mentioned in. Darren had removed my name entirely from the contingency clause, even though I never asked to be part of it. She sounded hesitant, as if waiting for me to protest. I told her I understood, and I did. If they needed to rewrite history to justify my absence, so be it. Let them sign papers. Let them erase me in ink. I knew the truth wasn't stored in legal language. It lived in memories they couldn't format or file away. That night, I took out the old photo albums, not to reminisce, but to sort. I pulled out the pictures that no longer matched the present, Christmas mornings, around a tree they no longer invited me to, birthdays, where I held the cake they now pretended they'd always made themselves. I placed them in a separate box, not marked trash, not donate, just no longer needed. There was peace in choosing what parts of my story I didn't want to carry forward. I mailed a letter back to the bookstore, just a short note. I told Evelyn I'd join the reading, but only if I could write something new. I didn't want to talk about what used to be. I wanted to speak from where I stood now. I signed it with my full name, not Mom, not Mrs. Colson, not anyone's placeholder. The next morning, I bought paint. Just 3 colors, soft gray, deep blue, and 1 sharp gold. I didn't have a canvas. I used the old tabletop from the back shed, sanded it down until the surface felt like memory, rough in places, but stable. I didn't sketch. I didn't plan. I just started with long strokes, wide curves, and let the rhythm of silence guide the shape. Outside, the snow had melted in streaks, exposing dirt and stone and patches of what would soon be green again. Nothing looked dramatic, but everything had changed. The cabin, the air, the way my own body stood inside it. There was room now, and not just for me, but for something I hadn't felt in years, ease. When I stepped back from the table, brush still in hand, I saw it clearly. I hadn't painted a scene. I hadn't painted people, just movement, just form. It wasn't beautiful, but it was mine, entirely mine. The first time I walked into the bookstore again, the bell above the door made the same sound it always had, like a small chime from another life. But the weight I used to carry with that sound, of being needed, of being measured, had long since slipped away. The shelves looked unchanged, still lined with spines that faced outward like little flags from other people's minds. But I saw them differently now, not as destinations, but as echoes, places I could pass through without leaving pieces of myself behind. Evelyn met me near the back, her hands in her cardigan pockets, eyes soft. She didn't hug me. She didn't say, "Welcome back." She just handed me a folder with the event details and said, "You'll go on 3rd. You don't need to read a bio." I nodded. We understood each other better now, language pared down to what matters. That night, I stood in front of 30 chairs, most filled by strangers, a few by old colleagues who used to call me Elaine from the counter. I read, not from my old journal, not from any published essay, but from the new piece I'd written weeks before. It wasn't about grief. It wasn't about motherhood. It was about silence, and how sometimes it is the only language that refuses to betray you. I didn't expect applause. I didn't need it. When I finished, the room didn't clap right away. There was a beat of stillness, full, intact. Then someone exhaled. Then the hands followed. Afterward, a woman around my age came up. She didn't introduce herself. She just said, "That sounded like me." I smiled and said, "Then maybe it was." She nodded once and left. That was enough. Back at the cabin, I kept painting. Not for display, not for anyone's walls, just for the rhythm of movement it gave me. I planted herbs near the porch steps. Not many, just thyme, rosemary, and a bit of mint that would probably overgrow, but it felt like claiming space the way roots do, quietly, insistently. I stopped checking the mailbox every morning. If something needed to find me, it would. One morning in late spring, I found Becca's drawing had faded slightly. I replaced the magnet, adjusted the corner that had curled. Then I pulled out a small wooden frame I'd found at the thrift shop and slid the picture in. It didn't match the cabin's color scheme. I didn't care. It stayed on the kitchen shelf, next to my tea bags and the cracked ceramic cup I always reached for first. Darren sent an email. Just a line. Thinking of you. I closed it without answering, not out of anger, but because I had nothing to add. He could think of me all he wanted. But that wouldn't undo the moment he asked me to choose servitude over selfhood. Memory didn't work that way, and forgiveness, when it arrived, didn't come with a key to re-enter. By summer, Evelyn asked if I'd consider compiling some of my pieces into a small book. Not to sell, she said, just to give away, to women like you. I asked her what she meant by that, and she smiled. You know, the ones they thought were done. I told her I'd think about it. I still haven't said yes. Some things, even now, I keep for myself. The road to the cabin had grown familiar. I no longer noticed the sharp bend by the old post office or the way the pines leaned after the rain. I stopped marking dates on the calendar. I didn't need reminders to belong. I just belonged. One evening, as I sat on the porch, the wind carried a sound I hadn't heard in months, a child's laugh, high and quick, like a skipped stone across water. It didn't come from Becca. It came from somewhere deeper in the woods, someone else's family, someone else's dinner table. I didn't follow it. I let it pass. Inside, the fire waited. The table was set for one, and for the first time in years, that didn't feel like a subtraction. It felt like a full sentence, spoken without apology. One of the last things I did before summer ended was give away my old wedding china. The full set, plates, cups, saucers, the wide serving bowl with the gold rim that had only ever held food during holidays when the house was full and my hands moved faster than my mouth. I packed each piece into a box lined with newspaper, not because it needed to be protected, but because I needed the act to be gentle. I brought it to the donation center in town, placed it on the table, and signed nothing. It was not a transaction. It was a release. I didn't tell Darren. I didn't tell anyone. That set had been passed down from his side, gifted with the kind of weight only families who fear forgetting assign to porcelain. I carried it for decades like a symbol of duty, of history I hadn't written but had been expected to preserve. Let someone else shape their holidays around it now. My hands were done holding what never belonged to me. A week later, I received a message from a woman named Angela. She said she'd found a copy of one of my essays at the bookstore and wanted to know if she could read it aloud at a group she ran for women recently divorced or widowed. I said yes without hesitation, not because I needed the credit, but because the idea of my words walking into a room full of strangers and sitting quietly among them felt right, like they belonged more out there than locked inside old notebooks. That same afternoon, I got a letter in the mail, no return address, just my name, handwritten in a familiar, uneven style. Inside was a card, thick and cream-colored, a wedding invitation, Becca's. She was marrying next fall, and I was invited. Not as mom, not as mother of the groom, not as any titled presence, just Elaine Colson. No +1, no SAT designation. I read it twice. Then folded it back and placed it in the drawer beside the paintbrushes I hadn't touched in weeks. I didn't cry. Not because it didn't mean anything, but because it meant exactly what I thought it would. This was their attempt to tidy the past without having to re-enter it, a way of saying, "We haven't forgotten you," while still refusing to see me. I didn't send a reply. I also didn't tear it up. It would stay there, untouched, until time made the question irrelevant. Later that evening, Evelyn came by. She brought plums from the market and a tin of loose tea labeled with my name in black marker. She didn't ask about the invitation. She didn't need to. Instead, we sat on the porch and she told me about a woman in her 70s who'd just published her first collection of poetry. She wrote it in rehab, Evelyn said, stirring sugar into her cup, said the poems helped her stay upright. I thought about that for a long time after she left, not about publishing, but about staying upright, about how many years I had spent leaning into roles, into silence, into the shape others needed me to hold, and how different it felt now, standing without that tilt. Before bed, I opened the drawer again, looked at the invitation, then quietly I wrote one of my own, not on cardstock, just a note in the margin of a journal I kept beside the lamp. On this day, I wrote, I married no one, I hosted no one, I fed no one, I simply stayed home, and it was enough. I woke early on the morning of Becca's wedding. The cabin was quiet, wrapped in a kind of soft hush only late autumn knew how to hold. Light came slow, filtering through the trees like it didn't want to disturb anything. I made tea, poured it into the heavy ceramic mug, and sat by the window without checking the time. I didn't need to. Somewhere, hours away, people were dressing. Music would start soon. Someone would rush to fix a misaligned bouquet. A photographer would call for smiles. My name might be mentioned, probably in passing, maybe as a formality. I imagined Darren straightening his tie, wondering if the absence would be noticed. I didn't wonder long. Instead, I pulled out the sketchbook Evelyn had given me weeks before. Not for art this time, just paper, clean space. I wrote a list, not of regrets, not of what was taken, but of what remained. A porch, a key that always fit, the sound of wind moving through pine, a friendship that arrived too late to save the past, but just in time to soften the future. My own name, no longer attached to a title. Around midday, I changed into my boots and coat, grabbed the woven basket, and walked the short trail behind the cabin. The earth was damp, but not muddy. A good day to gather. I found what I needed slowly. Fallen leaves in burnt red, a handful of smooth stones near the creek, bits of bark with tiny patterns that reminded me of maps. I placed them in the basket, not for decoration, but to mark the day in a way that belonged only to me. Back inside, I spread them across the kitchen table. No centerpiece, no candles, just the things I had chosen, gathered with hands that no longer trembled under the weight of obligation. I boiled potatoes, roasted carrots, made a dish of lentils that filled the room with warmth. I ate alone. Every bite tasted like something I'd once served to others without sitting down myself. That was the difference now. I stayed seated. Evening came quietly. I lit the fire, not for guests, not for show, just to feel the crackle and watch the shadows shift across the floor. I opened a book but didn't read it. I let the sound of pages turning be enough. At some point, I glanced at the framed drawing by the fridge, the one Becca made when she was 6. The lines had faded further, and the colors looked almost ghosted, but the shape was still clear, a tall figure, arms wide, with a little son over her shoulder. She once told me it was me, being bigger than the house. I smiled. She hadn't known then how true that would become. I didn't think about the speeches being made that night, or the names listed in the program, or the photos that would later be framed without me. Those things no longer demanded my presence. They belonged to a world I had already exited, not with bitterness, but with clarity. Before bed, I stepped outside. The air was cold, clean. Above, the stars came out slowly, each one quiet, refusing to compete. I stood there, arms wrapped around myself, and whispered a line I had once read in a book I couldn't recall. This is where I chose myself. And I meant it.